Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into something that definitely tweaks our schedules twice a year in many parts of the world.
Yeah.
Daylight saving time, or DST.
hmm
It's spring forward, fall back. But that simple 1 hour shift, it unlocks a surprisingly complex story.
It really does. At its heart, daylight saving time, which, yeah, you might also hear called summertime, is about trying to better match our active hours with the available daylight,
Right.
especially during those longer spring and summer days. Globally, as of 2023, it's around a third, maybe 34% of countries using it, although sometimes it's just, in certain regions.
And it's fascinating to see the patchwork of where DST isn't a thing or where maybe they've gone permanent.
Yeah.
You've got places like Yukon and most of Saskatchewan and Canada, right?
Mhm.
And in the U.S., Hawaii, and most of Arizona, except for the Navajo Nation there.
That's right.
Even within countries like Australia, I think it's only 4 states in one territory that observe it. So you, our listener, you're likely familiar with the spring and fall clock changes. Our goal today is to really unpack the why, the how, and maybe the so what behind this seemingly simple tweak.
Okay, let's dive into the core rationale first. Fundamentally, DST, it emerged from industrialized societies, places with clock-based schedules.
Okay.
This is quite contrast to agrarian societies, where life is much more synced with the natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset, what we'd call solar time.
Right, governed by the sun.
Exactly. And think about it. As you move away from the equator, the amount of daylight we get changes pretty dramatically throughout the year.
Yeah, big difference between summer and winter.
Right. Closer to the equator, DST makes, well, much less sense because that seasonal daylight shift is minimal.
That makes perfect sense. So the idea is to shift our clock-based day to take better advantage of those extended daylight hours in summer.
Precisely.
Can you give us a concrete example? How does this work in practice?
Absolutely. Okay. Imagine you're in a temperate latitude, say in America, during the summer solstice. On standard time, sunrise might be around 4:30 a.m.
Wow, early.
Yeah, and sunset maybe around 7:30 p.m. Since most of us are still fast asleep at 4:30 a.m., the argument for DST is that it's, well, more practical to push the clock forward an hour.
Okay.
So this effectively treats 4:30 a.m. as 5:30 a.m., meaning more people wake up closer to sunrise, and crucially, they get to enjoy an extra hour of daylight in the evening. Sunset moves to about 8:30 p.m.
Ah, I see. That extra evening light.
Exactly. It's a big draw for after-work activities. The classic example is always golfers trying to squeeze in another round before dark.
Right, that extra daylight for evening fun.
Yeah.
Now, what about the energy saving argument? We hear that one quite a bit.
We do, yeah. And it's been a key part of the DST debate right from the start. The initial thinking was, okay, shift daylight to the evening, we'd reduce our need for artificial lighting, maybe even heating.
Saving energy.
That was the hope. However, whether it actually does save energy overall is highly debatable. Studies have shown really conflicting results.
Whoa.
Yeah, and we need to look at the bigger picture. While we might use less electricity for lights in the evening.
You might use more AC.
Exactly. More air conditioning during those longer, brighter, potentially hotter evenings. So the net energy effect is really complex. It's not as straightforward as it might sound.
It's definitely more complicated than just flipping a switch, literally and figuratively. And I'd imagine trying to get everyone on the same page with this across different regions, different time zones, that must add another layer of complexity.
Oh, absolutely. Even within a single time zone, the amount of daylight you actually get varies depending on how far east or west you are within that zone.
True.
So when you implement DST, it's crucial to have synchronized clock changes. You need everyone in that jurisdiction observing DST to shift their clocks at the same designated time to avoid, well, widespread confusion and disruption.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's rewind a bit then and look at the history. Has DST always been this common practice we see today?
Oh, not at all. I mean, the basic idea of adjusting schedules to daylight isn't entirely new.
Huh.
There's a record, I think, of the Spanish National Assembly back in 1810 deciding to move certain meeting times forward during summer months.
Really? 1810?
Yeah, though they didn't physically change the clocks. But the first modern proposal for what we know as DST came from a New Zealand entomologist.
An insect guy.
Yeah, George Hudson in 1895. His motivation was quite personal, actually. His job gave him spare time to collect insects, and he just wanted more evening daylight for his hobby.
Huh.
He actually proposed a pretty ambitious 2-hour shift.
2 hours. Wow. That's a big jump. What came of that idea? Did it catch on?
Well, it sparked some interest, particularly locally in Christchurch, but it didn't really take off widely at the time. Then, independently, a bit later, 1907, a British builder and keen golfer named William Willett came up with a similar idea. He apparently noticed how many Londoners were still asleep during those bright, early summer mornings.
Wasting daylight.
Exactly. And as a golfer, he wasn't happy about his games being cut short by dusk. So he published his proposal suggesting we advance clocks during the summer. A member of Parliament, Robert Pearce, championed Willett's idea, introduced the first daylight saving bill in the UK in 1908.
So the UK was talking about it early on, but when did it actually get implemented on a large scale, like nationally?
The first national implementations, those happened during World War I.
Ah, the war effort.
Precisely. In 1916, both the German and Austro-Hungarian empires adopted DST. It was a wartime measure specifically to conserve coal, which was critical.
Makes sense.
And Britain and most of their allies, plus many neutral European countries, they quickly followed suit. The United States adopted it in 1918.
So WWI was the real catalyst.
It seems so. Funnily enough, Port Arthur, Ontario, in Canada, actually implemented DST locally even earlier, back in 1908. But yeah, the war pushed it wide. However, after World War I ended,
People dropped it.
most places did, yeah. There were exceptions. Canada, the UK, France, Ireland, the US kept some form of it, sometimes locally. It became common again during World War II, sometimes even with double summertime.
Double. 2 hours.
Yes, a 2-hour shift in some places to maximize evening daylight for war production. Then it was standardized in the U.S. with the Uniform Time Act in 1966, and it became widespread across Europe starting in the 1970s, largely driven by the energy crisis then.
It's amazing how these major global events, the world wars, the energy crisis, really drove the adoption of DST.
Yeah.
Okay, but I've definitely heard the story, maybe that's a myth then, that it was implemented to help farmers.
Yes. That is a really common misconception, especially in the United States.
So not true.
The reality is almost the exact opposite. Farmers have historically been one of the strongest lobbying groups against DST.
Against it. Why?
Well, their schedules are just dictated by the sun, aren't they? Things like morning dew affecting when they can work in the fields, or the milking schedules of dairy cattle, those don't change just because the clock does.
Right, the cows don't care what time the clock says.
Exactly. So for farmers, DST actually creates unnecessary complications in their already sun-dependent routines.
Wow, that completely flips the script on the story I've always heard. So what about the U.S. experience specifically after that initial wartime adoption in WWI?
Well, after WWI, the U.S. Congress actually repealed the national DST law.
They got rid of it.
They tried. President Woodrow Wilson, who, interestingly, was a golf enthusiast like Willett.
Ah, the golf connection again?
Right. He vetoed the repeal twice, but his second veto was ultimately overridden by Congress. So for a while, only a few U.S. cities kept observing DST locally, often to align their financial trading hours with London.
Okay.
Then, during World War II, year-round DST, which they called wartime, was implemented again.
Right, for the war effort.
Then after the war, it went back to being sort of patchy up to local jurisdictions until that 1966 Uniform Time Act standardized it across the country, allowing states to opt out but not create their own versions.
And wasn't there an experiment with permanent DST?
Yes, briefly. In 1974, because of another energy crisis, they tried year-round DST. But it was really unpopular. People hated the dark winter mornings, especially for kids going to school.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It was scrapped pretty quickly due to that widespread public dissatisfaction.
Dark winter mornings, that does sound like a major downside. It's interesting how public opinion has played such a big role. You also mentioned other influences, like the candy industry. Seriously, the candy industry.
Yes. It sounds odd, doesn't it? But that's a more recent and maybe surprising example of how special interests can nudge these decisions.
How'd that work?
Well, lobbyists from the candy industry apparently played a role in the 2007 extension of DST in the U.S. The extension meant DST would include Halloween.
Ah, more daylight for trick-or-treating.
That was the thinking. More daylight in the evening, more kids out longer, potentially leading to a boost in candy sales. It just highlights how various sectors can try to exert influence on what seems like a purely logistical thing.
Unbelievable. What about other countries? Have there been similar political or social battles over DST?
Oh, absolutely. All over. For example, in Queensland, Australia, they had a trial of DST for 3 years, and then in 1992, they held a referendum on making it permanent.
Now,
It was defeated. Strong opposition came from rural and regional areas, kind of echoing the farmer issue.
interesting.
And in the UK, you have groups like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents who've long supported year-round DST, arguing it could improve road safety. But they've faced resistance from other groups, particularly maybe in Scotland, where mornings would be even darker.
Right, the further north you go.
Exactly. And then there's Russia. They actually adopted permanent DST in 2011.
How did that go?
Not well. There were widespread complaints about those really dark winter mornings, just like the U.S. experienced in '74. So they abandoned it in 2014 and switched back, eventually settling on permanent standard time. So the debate, the outcomes, they really vary across the globe. It reflects different priorities, different climates, different public opinions.
It really does. Okay, so let's get practical. How exactly does this clock change procedure work? It sounds simple: forward an hour, back an hour. But are there any quirky details?
The basic process is just that. Advance clocks by 1 hour in the spring, usually very early morning on a weekend. Sunday morning is common.
To minimize disruption.
Right. Minimize disruption to the standard work week. Then in the autumn, clocks are turned back by 1 hour. Again, usually early on a weekend morning, midnight, or maybe 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. is the typical time for these changes.
And it's usually 1 hour.
Usually, yes.
Oh.
A 1 hour shift is the standard pretty much everywhere that uses it now. But there have been, and still are, some interesting exceptions. Lord Howe Island off Australia, they use a 30-minute change, just half an hour.
Half an hour, that's unique.
It is a bit quirky, and apparently the Troll Research Station in Antarctica actually shifts by 2 hours, jumping directly between time zones when they change.
Wow. Okay, so mostly an hour, but with some oddities.
Yeah.
What happens with all our digital devices now?
Yeah.
Phones, computers, they seem to handle the switch pretty seamlessly these days.
Yes, thankfully. Most modern digital clocks, computers, operating systems, they're all programmed to handle these transitions automatically. In the spring, at the designated time, say 2:00 a.m. becomes 3:00 a.m., the display will just jump forward.
Skips an hour.
Right, skips from, say, 1:59 on 5:00 a.m. to 3:00 a.m. In the autumn, though, when turning back from, let's say, 2:00 a.m.,
Uh-oh.
well, the hour between 1:00 a.m. and 1:59 a.m. effectively happens twice.
Right. The same hour repeats.
Exactly, which can sometimes cause, minor confusion for systems or people dealing with very precise timestamping, like which 1:30 a.m. was it?
That repeated hour in the fall sounds like a little glitch in the matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what about the words we use? I've definitely heard both daylight saving time and daylight savings time. Is one technically more correct?
Yes, the use question. That's a common point of confusion, especially it seems in American English. Technically, daylight saving time without the "es" is the original and grammatically considered the correct form.
Saving daylight.
Exactly. As in, the practice saves daylight. However, daylight savings time with "es" has become incredibly common, almost standard in everyday speech.
So people just say it that way.
Pretty much. Dictionaries often list the older form first, but acknowledge the widespread acceptance of the plural savings. You'll also hear other variations like just daylight time or, especially in Europe, summertime.
Summertime, right.
And even how it's written, hyphenated or not, can vary. So yeah, the terminology itself is a bit fluid.
It sounds like even the name of this thing isn't totally fixed. Finally, on the mechanics, how do computers and the internet manage all these different time changes happening in different parts of the world at different times? It must be a huge logistical challenge.
It is a significant operation, yes, but thankfully we have pretty well-established systems in place now. Most computing systems, internally, they handle and store all times as Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC.
UTC, which doesn't change.
Correct. UTC never observes DST. It's the constant global standard. Then, systems rely on time zone databases. The most famous one is the INAS database.
Okay.
These databases contain all the rules, historical and predicted, for DST for every specific location around the world. They tell the computer how to convert UTC to the correct local time, including whether DST is active or not.
And these databases get updated.
Constantly. Whenever the rules for DST change in a particular area, like When a country decides to stop using it or change the dates these databases are updated, it happens as part of regular system software updates, which is why our phones and computers mostly handle the transitions without us even noticing.
It's reassuring to know there's this whole intricate system working quietly in the background to keep our clocks, well, mostly in sync. Okay, now let's really get to the heart of the matter. What are the actual real-world effects of daylight saving time? The pros and cons.
Right. This is where the discussion often gets quite lively, quite debated. Proponents, those who support DST, often argue that, well, it saves energy.
Which we already said is debatable.
Highly debatable, yes.
Yeah.
But they also say it encourages outdoor leisure activities, might have some health benefits because of that increased evening daylight, maybe reduces traffic accidents.
Reduce the...
That's an argument, yes. Also potentially lowers crime rates and is generally good for certain businesses, retail, sports, tourism, maybe.
Okay, so a list of potential benefits. And what are the main arguments on the other side? What are the downsides people point to?
The arguments against DST are pretty significant, and they often focus on the negative impacts. Health is a major one.
Health, how so?
Well, research has indicated that the sudden clock shifts, especially the spring-forward one, can disrupt our natural sleep-wake cycles, our circadian rhythms.
Like jet lag?
Sort of, yeah, kind of
Yeah.
societal jet lag. This can lead to sleep deprivation, which has knock-on effects, and potentially it increases the risk of serious health issues like heart attacks, particularly in the days immediately following the spring shift.
Really? Heart attack?
There's research suggesting a correlation, yes. Also, there's some research, though the evidence varies a bit, suggesting a temporary increase in traffic accidents right after the spring transition, likely due to that sleep loss.
Increase. So the opposite of the argument for it.
Exactly. The data is complex. One 2017 study even estimated that over 30 additional deaths per year in the U.S. could be linked just to the spring DST transition, mainly attributed to the effects of losing that hour of sleep.
Oh.
The European Parliament also looked into this, focusing on the impact on circadian rhythms, and noted a possible small increase in heart attacks, particularly in that week following the spring shift. It's led many experts in sleep medicine and chronobiology to actually recommend year-round standard time for better public health.
Standard time, not permanent DST.
Correct. We'll come back to that distinction, but yes, standard time is generally seen as better aligned with our internal body clocks.
Okay, those are some serious health concerns. What about the economic effects beyond the debated energy savings?
Some argue that the clock shifts themselves can be linked to decreased economic efficiency. For instance, there's a study back in 2000 suggesting a pretty substantial one-day loss on U.S. stock exchanges that could be attributed to the DST transition, though again, these findings have been debated. And then beyond the sort of large-scale economic, there's just the simple inconvenience factor for individuals, right?
Yeah.
Remembering to change all your clocks, especially the analog ones.
My microwave clock is always wrong for half the year.
Exactly. Then there's the added complexity for people who work across time zones, especially if one zone changes and the other doesn't, or they change on different dates.
That must be a nightmare.
It can be. Plus the shifting links of our calendar days, the potential for disruptions to schedules, to automated systems. And as we already discussed, farmers generally don't like it because it messes with their sun-based work routines.
Right.
And there are also those concerns about children going to school or waiting for buses in darker mornings during the DST period, especially in the spring and fall shoulders.
So it really sounds like this seemingly small clock change sends ripples through many, many different parts of our lives, from our physical health to the economy to just daily convenience.
It absolutely does.
Now, let's briefly touch on some of the more specific areas where DST interacts with society. You mentioned politics, like the candy lobby. What about religion and sports?
Certainly. We've seen how political lobbying can influence DST policy. Religious perspectives also play a role. For instance, some Orthodox Jewish groups have opposed extensions to DST and even permanent DST proposals.
Why is that?
Because the later sunrise times, especially under DST or permanent DST, can interfere with the timing requirements for morning prayers and then subsequently affect their ability to get to work on time according to religious law.
Ah, okay. Makes sense.
And most Islamic countries also don't observe DST. This is particularly relevant during Ramadan, the month of fasting, as DST would significantly delay the time of the evening meal, the iftar, which breaks the fast each day.
Right, that would make a long fast even longer.
Exactly. And then historically, sports have definitely had connections to DST. We mentioned William Willett's desire for more daylight for golf.
The original golfing lobbyist.
Kind of. And there are reports that golf ball sales actually increased after DST was first implemented in the US. More generally, longer evening daylight hours are often linked to increased participation in after-school sports for kids and maybe more attendance at professional sporting events, too.
It's fascinating to see all these different threads, candy, religion, golf, all connecting to something that just seems like moving the clock hand. Okay, so where does that leave us now? What's the current status of DST around the world, and what are some of the ongoing proposals for change?
Well, there's definitely a growing global discussion, maybe even momentum, about whether we should continue with these seasonal clock changes at all. In the United States, for example, there seems to be increasing support for ending the switch.
Ending it altogether.
Yes, polls in, say, 2025 suggest a slight majority might now favor abolishing the twice-yearly change. But then the debate immediately becomes, okay, if we stop switching, do we switch to permanent standard time or permanent daylight saving time?
Ah, the big question. Standard or DST year-round?
Exactly, and there's no clear consensus on that yet. Senator Marco Rubio has repeatedly introduced legislation, the Sunshine Protection Act, to make DST permanent in the U.S.
Has that gotten anywhere?
It actually passed the Senate unanimously back in 2022, which was surprising, but then it stalled in the House of Representatives. Concerns were raised there about, again, those potential negative consequences, especially the dark winter mornings, echoing that failed 1974 experiment.
So it's stuck for now.
Seems so. And it's important to remember, under current U.S. law, individual states can choose to opt out of DST and stay on permanent standard time, like Arizona and Hawaii have done.
Right.
But they cannot unilaterally decide to enact permanent DST on their own. That would require a change in federal law, like the Sunshine Protection Act aimed to do.
So states have some flexibility to stick with standard time year-round, but a nationwide shift to permanent DST needs action from Congress. What about other parts of the world? You mentioned Europe earlier.
Yes, the European Union has also been grappling with this for years. In 2019, the European Parliament actually voted quite decisively in favor of getting rid of the seasonal clock changes across the EU.
Okay, so they voted for it.
The Parliament did. However, the final decision rests with the European Council, which is made up of the heads of state or government of the member countries, and progress there has basically stalled. Member states couldn't agree on whether to stick with permanent summertime, DST, or permanent wintertime, standard time, or even on a coordinated timeline for the change.
Gridlock.
Pretty much. So while there was a clear push for change from the Parliament, the actual implementation across the EU is still very uncertain. It seems stuck at the national level now.
It sounds like there's a lot of talk and debate everywhere, but maybe not a lot of unified action happening globally yet. Are there examples of countries or regions that have actually gotten rid of the seasonal clock changes recently?
Yes, there are several. We mentioned Russia switching back and forth and eventually landing on permanent standard time. Argentina, Belarus, Iceland, they've all abolished seasonal clock changes and are on standard time year-round.
Okay.
Then you have places like Saskatchewan in Canada and the Yukon Territory, which have effectively adopted permanent DST by staying on their summer hours year-round, even if their official time zone designation might technically be standard time. And Turkey also made the switch to permanent DST a few years ago, citing potential energy savings and benefits for mental well-being, though that's also debated.
So when countries do stop the switching, they have to make that choice. Permanent standard or permanent DST.
Exactly. That becomes the crucial decision.
And just to be clear, what are the main arguments specifically for permanent DST versus against it?
Well, the arguments in favor of permanent DST often just mirror the perceived benefits of regular DST, more useful daylight in the evenings for activities, potentially good for retail, tourism, maybe road safety in the evenings, but crucially, without the disruption of the twice-yearly clock shifts.
So the DST benefits without the switching hassle.
That's the pitch. On the other hand, the main argument against permanent DST is, as we've kept coming back to, the issue of those later sunrises, especially during the winter months. This raises concerns about visibility, safety for commuters and children in the mornings, and that general misalignment with our natural body clocks.
It really seems we've come full circle back to those dark winter mornings being a major sticking point, whether it's temporary DST or permanent DST. So considering all the health concerns we discussed earlier, the circadian rhythm disruption, sleep loss, what's the general consensus among the, medical and scientific communities regarding these different proposals,
Yeah.
switching versus permanent standard versus permanent DST?
The overwhelming recommendation, really, from major chronobiology societies and groups like the American Academy of Sleep Medicine is for year-round standard time.
Standard time, not permanent DST.
Correct. Their argument is rooted in biology. Aligning our social schedules consistently with standard time, which is inherently closer to the sun's natural cycle, is better for our natural circadian rhythms, our overall health, our mood, and our well-being.
So standard time is seen as the healthier option.
Generally, yes. They view permanent DST as potentially creating a kind of permanent social jet lag, keeping us out of sync with the natural light-dark cycle year-round. They emphasize that the health benefits of permanent standard time seem to outweigh the arguments for either continuing the switch or permanently adopting DST.
Well, this has truly been a deep dive into the world of daylight saving time. It's clearly much more than just a simple clock adjustment, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's got these deep historical roots, all sorts of practical considerations, and these significant, often really debated impacts on our health, the economy, and just society in general.
Indeed. It's one of those topics that touches so many different aspects of our lives, often in ways we don't even really think about until we start digging into it.
Yeah. And on that note, we leave you, our listener, with this final thought to ponder. Considering everything we've explored today, the history, the rationale, the controversies, the health effects, what single aspect of the whole DST debate strikes you as most important and why? We encourage you to think about this ongoing discussion, maybe look into it a bit more, and form your own informed perspective. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.